تعجل بالقرآن من قبل أن يقضى إليك وحيه وقل رب زدني علما.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. So carrying on with Al-Aqidah Al-Wasitiyyah of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, we got to the section last time where Shaykh al-Islam was talking about the attribute of Allah of speech, Kalamullah. And we mentioned some of the ayat that Shaykh al-Islam mentioned as evidences that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the attribute of speech, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to some of the prophets and messengers, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks with the words that were heard, with the words and the sound that was heard by the messengers. So Allah spoke to Musa alayhi salam, and Musa alayhi salam heard Allah speak to him, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to Adam alayhi salam, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So this is something that is established and proven in the ayat of the Quran, in the ahadith from the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And last time we covered the opening ayat, and we got up to the ayah وَلَمَّا جَاءَ مُوسَى لِمِيقَاتِنَا وَكَلَّمَهُ رَبُّهُ. We covered that one. That was an evidence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to Musa alayhi salam directly, because prior to that the people of innovation had tried to say that the other ayah, when it mentioned وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا, they tried to change that and say وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهَ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا, to say that Musa spoke to Allah, but Allah did not speak to Musa. That's what they tried to claim. And it's mentioned that when one of the people of innovation went to a scholar of the past and used that evidence, وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا, and he said to the scholar, no, it's وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهَ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا, that Musa alayhi salam spoke to Allah. So it's mentioned that the scholar said to him, in that case, what are you going to say about the ayah وَلَمَّا جَاءَ مُوسَى لِمِيقَاتِنَا وَكَلَّمَهُ رَبُّهُ? You cannot change that one. That is clear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to Musa alayhi salam. So then the ninth ayah, وَإِذْ نَادَى رَبُّكَ مُوسَى أَنِ ائْتِ الْقَوْمَ الظَّالِمِينَ. These ayat with these kinds of meanings we had briefly touched upon last time too, where these ayat, they speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calling upon Musa. Allah calling Musa alayhi salam, وَإِذْ نَادَى رَبُّكَ مُوسَى. And the same in the 10th ayah, وَنَادَاهُمَا رَبُّهُمَا أَلَمْ أَنْهَكُمَا عَنْ تِلْكُمَا الشَّجَرَةِ. This one in reference to Adam alayhi salam, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and when he called upon them, or when their Lord called upon them, did I not forbid you from that tree? So this is again an evidence of the Kalamullah. يقرر أنه نهاهما عن تلكما الشجرة وهذا يدل على أن الله كلمهما من قبل. So this highlights that Allah had spoken to them before, because when Allah says أَلَمْ أَنْهَكُمَا عَنْ تِلْكُمَا الشَّجَرَةِ, says to Adam alayhi salam and Hawa, did I not prohibit you from that tree? And of course Allah had prohibited them from that tree. So this is a proof that previously Allah had spoken to them. Allah had spoken to Adam alayhi salam and Hawa when He had prohibited them from that tree, and that's what it means. Alam anhakuma an tilkuma shajara. Did I not prohibit you from that tree? And of course Allah had prohibited them from that tree. Therefore a proof that Allah had spoken to them also prior to this. فيدل على أن الله كلمهما من قبل وأن كلام الله بصوت وحرف, and that the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is with a sound and with words. ويدل على أنه يتعلق بمشيئته لقوله ألم أنهكما فإن هذا القول بعد النهي فيكون متعلقا بالمشيئة. And also the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is connected to His will. Allah speaks whenever He wills, whenever He wishes to speak. And so previously He had spoken to them, and then afterwards He spoke to them again. And the 11th ayah, وَيَوْمَ يُنَادِيهِمْ فَيَقُولُ مَاذَا أَجَبْتُمُ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. And on that day, when He will call upon them and say, what did you reply with? What was your response to the messengers who were sent? يعني واذكر يوم يناديهم وذلك يوم القيامة, meaning, and remember on that day when Allah will call on them, Allah will call upon them and say to them, فَيَقُولُ, He will say to them, ماذا أجبتم المرسلين. وفي هذه الآية إثبات الكلام من وجهين. So in this ayah, وَيَوْمَ يُنَادِيهِمْ فَيَقُولُ, there are two angles or two parts that prove the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Firstly, again, يُنَادِيهِمْ, that is an indication of the speech of Allah. And secondly, فَيَقُولُ, the qawl that Allah then says to them. Two points of evidence highlighting that Allah speaks to them. And this is not something strange at all. If you think about the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, when Ibrahim alayhi salam smashed all of their idols and he put the axe around the big one, then afterwards when the people, they saw all of their idols had been broken and smashed, and then they got Ibrahim and brought him, and then Ibrahim said to them, ask the big one, ask the idol, he will tell you who broke them all and who did this all. Because Ibrahim alayhi salam knew the idol cannot speak. He knew the idol cannot speak, and this was a refutation upon them. How can you be worshipping these idols and they do not even have the ability to speak? What kind of a God are you making these idols? They cannot even speak, indicating therefore that this was a deficiency in those idols. It was a deficiency that these so-called gods that they were claiming cannot even speak. And so it proves the opposite, that from perfection is that your Lord indeed speaks, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala indeed has the attribute of speech. How can it be that you say your Lord cannot speak? That is a deficiency. The idols they were worshipping, Ibrahim proved to them these are useless. They cannot even speak. He said to them, ask them who broke the others. And they knew that they cannot, because those idols cannot speak. They do not have any rububiyyah in them. They do not have any lordship in them. So this is from the perfection that indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks. And there are other evidences as well. On the day of judgment, in the hadith it mentions, ما من عبد إلا سيكلمه ربه يوم القيامة ليس بينه وبينه ترجمان. That there is not a single one from amongst you except that your Lord will speak to you on the day of judgment. And there will not be between you and Allah any interpreter, any translator, nobody in between. ما من عبد إلا سيكلمه ربه يوم القيامة ليس بينه وبينه ترجمان. There is not a single one of you except that Allah will speak to you on Yawmul Qiyamah, and there will not be any interpreter, any intermediary between you. So there are many evidences highlighting and affirming the Aqidah of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, that indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is attributed with the attribute of speech. Also here, there is a refutation against the people of innovation. Because the people of innovation, they claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not speak, and that Allah does not have the attribute of al-kalam, and they make up all types of other explanations for these ayat. You remember right at the beginning when we started Al-Wasitiyyah, right at the beginning we mentioned one of the reasons why the people of innovation, they went astray, was due to the fact that they gave precedence to their intellects over and above the texts. As the scholars mention this about them in the books of Aqidah, for them it was taqdeemul aql ala naql. Their intellects, they gave them priority over the texts. So when there was something in the texts that their minds couldn't understand, then they would alter those texts and change them to make them in a way that would fit with their intellect. Whereas we say as Ahlul Sunnah, no, the texts are there as they are. Even if some of them your mind cannot comprehend and work out something, that is not because there's any problem in the texts, in the ayat or the ahadith. That is because there is a shortcoming or some deficiency in your mind. You haven't been able to work it out, or you haven't been able to understand yet. The deficiency is in your mind, as Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned. If you see authentic evidences apparently contradicting each other, sometimes you might get an issue, some mas'ala, and the ahadith, all of the ahadith in that mas'ala, in that particular topic, when you look at them, it looks like there are some saying one thing and some saying another thing. It looks like there's some contradiction between the evidences. Shaykh al-Islam said, if all of those evidences are authentic, then in that case there is no contradiction between them. The contradiction is only in, Ibn Taymiyyah said, is only in your mind. You haven't understood the texts properly. And because of your deficiency, you think that there's a contradiction between these ayat or ahadith, or this part of the sunnah or that part of the sunnah. Ibn Taymiyyah said there's no contradiction between the authentic narrations. If you think there is, it's because you have some deficiency, you haven't been able to work something out, and so your mind thinks there's a problem. The problem isn't there, the problem is here. And you remember we've mentioned, as Shaykh Al-Fawzan said, everybody's level of ability is different. Some people, Shaykh Al-Fawzan gave the example of like the ayah in the Quran about the water filling up. When you have potholes in the road, when there are potholes in the road, some might be big potholes and some of them might be small potholes. When it rains, all of those potholes in the road fill up with water. If it's a big pothole, it will fill up with a lot of water when it rains. And if it's a small pothole, it will fill up with a small amount of water. But every pothole, whether it is big and deep or small and shallow, every pothole will fill up with some amount of water. That's as Shaykh Al-Fawzan mentioned this example. Every pothole will fill up with at least some water. Even if it's a tiny pothole, it will have a tiny amount of water. The Shaykh said that's how the minds of the people are. Maybe Allah has blessed someone with a deep mind, so they can take in a lot of the knowledge into that deep mind that Allah has blessed them with. And other people, maybe they've only been given a smaller level of understanding in their ability, so they can only take in a smaller amount of knowledge. But everybody can take in something from knowledge. Everybody has something in their ability. Maybe some have more, maybe some have less. But everybody has a level of ability that you can take that level of knowledge into your mind. So the people of innovation, they gave priority to their mind. Every time an ayah in the Quran didn't make sense to them, they just changed the meaning of the ayah until it made sense to them. And so Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah refuted that, Ibn al-Qayyim refuted that. Their books are full of refutations on those people of innovation, the philosophers, the Ahlul Kalam, the people of rhetoric. In fact, some scholars, they even used to say, scholars of the past, after Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, they used to say a person who doesn't read the books of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, who doesn't understand their books, will not understand Islam properly. Some scholars, they used to say this, scholars of Ahlul Sunnah. And obviously their point was that Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, they have given a lot of detail on these affairs of Aqidah, of Sunnah, of Tawheed. And so if you don't read their books, it's as if you're missing out on a huge amount of knowledge about the religion. So here then, the next section, it continues like a part B. The part A was affirming that one of the attributes of Allah is Al-Kalam. Part B from that is therefore affirming that the Quran is the speech of Allah. Part B from this topic is to therefore affirm that the Quran is the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen says regarding this, وهذه المسألة وقع فيها النزاع الكثير بين المعتزلة وأهل السنة. That there was a lot of debate and a lot of conflict that occurred between the Mu'tazilah and Ahlul Sunnah on this topic of the Quran being the speech of Allah. وحصل بها شر كثير على أهل السنة. And over this issue, a lot of evil occurred upon Ahlul Sunnah. وممن أوذي في الله في ذلك الإمام أحمد بن حنبل رحمه الله إمام أهل السنة. And you know in the history that one of the Imams, the great Imams, Al-Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, was greatly oppressed over this topic and over this issue because they wanted him to say that the Quran is created, it is not the speech of Allah. And he refused, as did some of the other ulama. And in history, you know, at that time when the trial occurred, when the fitna occurred, and there were multiple rulers, one after the next, and they were all upon that type of Mu'tazili belief that the Quran is created, it is not the speech of Allah, due to the influence at that time of the Greek philosophy. Much of the Greek philosophy at that time had become translated into Arabic, and so it began to influence the regions that were upon the Arabic language, and so some of them became influenced by that philosophy and rhetoric to the extent that the Aqidah became blurred and the Aqidah became deviated in some of them, and some of the rulers at that time were afflicted with that. And so Al-Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was one of them who was oppressed by those rulers. And some of the other scholars at the time, there are stories about them, what happened. Some of them were, when they were questioned and they were told, do you say the Quran is created then or not? And if they said, no, I don't say that, the Quran is the speech of Allah, it is not created, they would get thrown into prison, they would get beaten up, maybe they would even get killed. And it's mentioned how some of them, when they were asked, one of them said, when they said to them, is the Quran created then? He said, look, the Torah, the Zabur, the Injil, the Quran, all of these are created. And he was an Imam of Ahl Sunnah. He said, all of these are created. The Zabur, Torah, Injil, Quran, all of these are created. And so they left him. And what did he mean by that? The scholars, they highlighted it in his biography. He was saying the Zabur, the Torah, the Injil, the Quran, all of these are created. Meaning my four fingers are created. All of these are created. And he wasn't talking about the books, he was talking about his fingers. His intention was upon that. But some of the scholars wouldn't even do that. Some of the scholars, like Al-Imam Ahmad, they wouldn't even do that. Do something like that where it's like economical with the truth and it's indicating something but you mean something else. They wouldn't even do that. They would straight out refuse and say, no, the Quran is not created. It is the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Kalamullahi ghayru makhluq. Munazzal minhu bada'a wa ilayhi ya'ud. It's mentioned about one of them at that time when the fitna was occurring. And I forgot the name of the Imam, but one of the Imams at that time, he had been imprisoned or he had been taken by the rulers and they were saying to him, say the Quran is created. And he was refusing. And word got to his daughters. His daughters, wherever they were, they heard that their father, he was one of the Imams of the time, he has been taken by the rulers and they are telling him, say it, say the Quran is created. They sent a letter to him and they said to him, our father, it is more beloved to us. These are the daughters. His daughters are saying this to him, to their own father. It is more beloved to us that news comes to us of your death, that the ruler killed you because you refused to be upon that batil aqidah. it is more beloved to us that news comes to us of your death than news coming to us that you have said that the Quran is created. They said, we don't want to hear that. More beloved to us that news comes to us, he's killed you upon your correct and upright Aqidah, better than news coming to us and us hearing that you've stepped down and you've agreed and you've said the Quran is created. His own daughters, this was the level of Aqidah and the level of strength they had upon that correct methodology. So there were many trials that occurred at that time. الذي قال فيه بعض العلماء, some of the scholars, they said about Imam Ahmad, إن الله سبحانه وتعالى حفظ الإسلام أو قال نصره بأبي بكر يوم الردة وبالإمام أحمد يوم المحنة. That some of the scholars, they said, there were some people from amongst them who began to apostate after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, the riddah that occurred. Some people after the death of the Prophet ﷺ began to apostate, left Islam. And so who was the one who took hold of the affair at that time and straightened up the affair at that time when people began to fall into these doubts and apostating? Abu Bakr. It was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu who took hold of the affair at that time and maintained the people upon the truth when some of them began to apostate. So he was the one whom Allah gave victory to the religion to via Abu Bakr when the apostasy occurred. And then the scholar said, and as for when the trial occurred, meaning of the Quran, people saying the Quran is created, then Allah gave victory to this religion via Al-Imam Ahmad. Allah gave victory to this religion via Abu Bakr as-Siddiq when they apostated, and Allah gave victory to this religion via Al-Imam Ahmad when they began to say the Quran is created, and that trial occurred. So that was when some of those rulers had become influenced by the Greek philosophy and rhetoric and those affairs that had entered into their Aqidah. And that was at the time Al-Ma'mun. عفى الله عنا وعنه أجبر الناس على أن يقولوا بخلق القرآن حتى إنه صار يمتحن العلماء ويقتلهم إذا لم يجيبوا. At that time, it was the one known as Al-Ma'mun. He was the ruler, and he was forcing the people to say that the Quran is created. It's not the speech of Allah, it's created. He was forcing them to say that, and he was testing the scholars upon that. The scholars of the time. And remember, this was 200 years or so after the death of the Prophet. This was only a couple of 100 years after the death of the Prophet. Many of the Salaf were still there. And Al-Ma'mun was testing some of those scholars at the time upon this issue. Do you say the Quran is created or not? And he was killing some of them when they refused to say that, and they refused to give up their Aqidah. وأكثر العلماء رأوا أنهم في فصحى من الأمر وصاروا يتأولون. And at that time, the trial was so great. The authorities, the ruler, was testing all of the scholars, checking them, what do you say, what do you say? And killing them and beating them if they refused. A great trial. And so many of the scholars at that time, they took the position that it's permissible for them to take a position whereby they maybe demonstrate something that appeases the ruler, even if they don't believe it. Like the thing about the fingers. Many of them took the position they can do things like that to save themselves from the trial that was occurring. إما بأن الحال حال إكراه والمكره إذا قال الكفر وقلبه مطمئن بالإيمان فإنه معفو عنه. We know in the religion that the one who is compelled to do something of kufr or shirk, compelled to do it, and your heart is content upon iman, then you are not held accountable. If you are compelled and forced to do something which is against the religion, your heart does not want to do it, you are upon tawheed and iman and sunnah, but you are forced and compelled, then we know in the religion you are not then held accountable. It's not your fault then, compelled and forced. The only question is, what is the meaning of compulsion? What is the meaning of compulsion? Anyone? What level does it have to get to for you to be considered as compelled? Anyone? If I get my keys and I say I'm going to hit your hand with my keys, get your hand out. Either say something or I'm going to hit you on, is that compulsion? They could hurt. Is it compulsion? That isn't compulsion. So what's compulsion? What level? Death. If they've killed you, khalas. So what's the compulsion? They say they are going to kill you. For example, if they say they are going to kill you, if I've got a gun and I say either say it or I'm going to shoot you. You know, some of the scholars, they even say it's not even compulsion yet. They say the threat by itself may not necessarily be compulsion. If they actually start shooting, they shoot you in the leg, they shoot you in the arm, and they say now the next one is going in your head. Now you can say definitely there is compulsion. But some of the scholars, they say if you're being threatened, but they haven't actually done anything yet, some of the scholars say there's no compulsion yet. So there is a bit of a difference, but the compulsion has to be something which is real. They are maybe beating you and beating you and beating you until you're about to fall unconscious. Now you could say, I am in a level of compulsion. But even at the beginning, if he comes with a stick and he starts beating you or gets a whip and starts whipping you, the first time he whips you, are you in compulsion yet? Scholars, they say no. You're not in compulsion. Okay, it's gonna hurt, but you're not in compulsion yet. He gets a stick and he starts hitting you on the leg, a cricket bat starts hitting you on the leg. Yet, they say not necessarily compulsion. But if he starts 2, 3, 4, 5 times now, starts beating you, now you know it's getting to a level he's gonna take your life possibly. So now you could say, okay, it's compulsion. So the point is, the scholars, they say it has to be something real and tangible to be considered compulsion. Not just somebody who says, say it now, I'm going to hit the keys on your hand. You can't say that's compulsion, that's nothing. So even with that compulsion, some scholars didn't do anything, but other scholars, and they were in compulsion because he was actually killing people. So there was actual compulsion, no doubt. So some of the scholars, they took the position, this comes under the ruling of the religion, where compulsion, you are not held accountable upon it. And so they said certain words regarding the Quran and creation of the Quran, etc., knowing that this comes under compulsion and they'll be excused. وَإِمَّا بِتَنْزِيلِ اللَّفْظِ عَلَى غَيْرِ ظَاهِرِهِ, or either by doing some type of being economical with the truth, like the example we gave, يتأولون فيقولون مثلا القرآن والتوراة والإنجيل والزبور هذه مخلوقة. So they do something like that, say these are all created, and they're talking about their fingers, or they give some other type of word or some other type of phrase where they think with that phrase they are agreeing the Quran is created, but it's an ambiguous type of phrase where they didn't actually mean that. So some of the scholars began doing that. أما الإمام أحمد ومحمد بن نوح رحمهما الله فأبيا ذلك. But as for Al-Imam Ahmad and Muhammad ibn Nuh, rahimahumullah, both of them, they refused to take any of those options. And that's mentioned in the religion, even when you are at absolute compulsion, shot in the leg, shot in the leg, shot in the arm, shot in the arm. He says, next one in your head, it is permissible for you to still say, I'm not going to listen to you. And maybe he kills you. You can remain upon the truth. And so Al-Imam Ahmad and Muhammad ibn Nuh, it is mentioned that they refused anything that they were trying to convince them to say. And they said, قَالَ الْقُرْآنُ كَلَامُ اللَّهِ مُنَزَّلٌ غَيْرُ مَخْلُوقٍ. The Quran is the speech of Allah. Allah spoke the Quran, it's His speech. It is not created, it was revealed from Allah. وَرَأَيَا أَنَّ الْإِكْرَاهِ في هذا المقام لا يسوغ لهما أن يقولا خلاف الحق. And they were of the opinion that compulsion, and compulsion was there, people were being killed. They were of the opinion this compulsion does not apply for them. It doesn't apply to them. That they don't have the permission of the compulsion argument. لأن المقام مقام جهاد. Because that situation they were in, it was like the situation of jihad for the truth against falsehood. والإكراه يقتضي العفو إذا كانت المسألة شخصية بمعنى أن تكون على الشخص نفسه. أما إذا كانت المسألة لحفظ شريعة الله فالواجب أن يتبرع الإنسان برقبته لحفظ شريعة الله عز وجل. And they were of the opinion that compulsion, it's in the religion, it's allowed, but that is only if it is something personal to you. That you personally are being compelled and forced to do something, so under compulsion you could do that thing and your heart is content upon Iman and you are forgiven. And this issue isn't connected to anybody else. But this issue of the Quran, was it only personal to those scholars or was it connected to everyone? Everyone. If Al-Imam Ahmad had come out and said, okay, I'll take the permission here in the religion regarding compulsion and I'll say it. If he had said it, how many of the masses of the people would have been affected? That what? Even Al-Imam Ahmad said it. So that must be okay then. How many people would have been affected if Al-Imam Ahmad had backed down and said, okay, the Quran is created? That was not something personal to him now. His speech and his position was going to be influencing the masses of the people at that time. And Al-Imam Ahmad, he was as they say, a mountain of knowledge. There's one narration, one time, Al-Imam Ahmad, and they were humble people. They were humble people despite their level of knowledge. And when we talk about level of knowledge, they had hundreds and thousands of chains of narration and a hadith. One time it's mentioned he was carrying some wood, like firewood for the fireplace or something. Carrying some wood and going home. Got the wood from somewhere and he was carrying it, Al-Imam Ahmad, by himself and going home. And he was walking through the market to get home. The route home went through some street where there was a market or something. So he was walking with this wood through that street going home. And some of the shopkeepers, they noticed it's Al-Imam Ahmad. So they all dropped their shops and their stalls when everybody realized it's Ahmad, Al-Imam Ahmad. They all stopped their stalls and their shops and they all came running to the middle of the street. And they all came running. They said, we'll carry your wood for you. We'll do this, we'll do that. Such was his level and status like that. And Imam Ahmad refused all of that from them. Refused all of that from them. From his humility and humbleness. In fact, Sufyan al-Thawri perhaps, I think, he mentions, or one of the scholars of the time, he says, I accompanied Imam Ahmad for 50 years. And never once did he say, or speak about his virtue over us. his virtue and his level and his station and rank, and he had station and rank. Al-Imam Ahmad had station and rank. It's not like, somebody now memorizes the text of Al-Wasitiyyah as you should be doing. Alhamdulillah, that is station and rank. You've memorized Al-Wasitiyyah. But then imagine how much the likes of Al-Imam Ahmad had. Al-Imam Ahmad, Al-Imam Malik, Al-Imam Shafi'i, those scholars of that time. Al-Imam Shafi'i, they say, his memory was so strong that when he was memorizing some hadith from a page, he would cover up the other page to memorize this hadith on that page. Why? They say because his memory was so strong, if he was looking at this page to memorize the hadith, if he looked here, he would end up memorizing that page too. And that wasn't what he wants to memorize. He wants to memorize this hadith. He would cover up that page. So he memorizes this side. Otherwise, they say his memory was like that. Allah had blessed him. If he's got the full book open, he'll end up memorizing it all. And he doesn't need that section right now. Us now, completely the opposite. Not you have to cover it up, you have to keep looking at it a million times to finally memorize it. So these were the scholars of the time, and that's why Al-Imam Ahmad, he viewed that it's not permissible for him to do the ikrah, to take that position, because if he does that, all of the people, they will be influenced by what he's done. So when it comes to an issue that is wide and it influences all of the people and it's about preservation of the Sharia, then it is not permissible, he viewed, to take the license of the ikrah. فلو قال الإمام أحمد في ذلك الوقت إن القرآن مخلوق ولو بتأويل أو لدفع الإكراه لقال الناس كلهم القرآن مخلوق وحينئذ يتغير المجتمع الإسلامي من أجل دفع الإكراه لكنه صمم فصارت العاقبة له ولله الحمد. So if he was to give in and say the Quran is created, then all of the people would have said the Quran is created following Al-Imam Ahmad. And so he refused to do that and refused to say that. المهم أن القول في القرآن جزء من القول في كلام الله. So the point here is that talking about the Quran being the speech of Allah, it is a subsection of the overall topic of the Sifatul Kalam, the attribute of speech of Allah. The Quran is a subsection within that topic. لكن لما وقعت فيه المحنة وصار محك النزاع بين المعتزلة وأهل السنة صار الناس يفردون القول في القرآن بكلام خاص. Even though this topic of the Quran being the speech of Allah isn't an independent topic, it's part of the topic of the speech of Allah overall. But you notice the scholars, they wrote specific books about the Quran, and that was due to this fitna that occurred at the time of Al-Imam Ahmad. Otherwise, that topic just comes under the topic of the speech of Allah. And that's a bit like some other topics as well, like wiping over the socks. That topic of wiping over the socks, some of the scholars even used to mention that chapter in the books of Aqidah. In the books of fiqh, obviously it's there. But some of the scholars even mention, look in their books, they mention the issue of wiping over the socks in the books of Aqidah. Why? Because some of the people of innovation, they had argued against that sunnah. And they had started taking positions upon that sunnah. So the scholars of the sunnah began putting that topic into the books of Aqidah even, highlighting the virtue and the value and the importance and need of following the sunnah. So when this huge fitna occurred between the Mu'tazilah and Ahlus Sunnah over the issue of the Quran and whether the Quran is created or not, then Ahlus Sunnah began explaining and detailing that issue to make it clear. And that's something even to this day you see the people confused about, and you see the people making mistakes on this issue of the Quran because they are not grounded in Aqidah. They have never studied Aqidah properly. I mean, look at us now. We've done maybe 30, 40 lessons. And we are just about halfway in Al-Aqidah Wasitiyyah. We are just about halfway now, just a bit more than halfway. 30, 40 lessons so far. So maybe 80 lessons will finish this book, covering the Aqidah of Ahl Sunnah, inshaAllah. But many people, they don't. Who's going to sit down for 80 lessons to learn the Aqidah of Ahl Sunnah? They want entertainment, they want drama, they want YouTube. They want to watch different shows and programs, or even arguments and debates, and the Deobandi debates the Sunni and this one debates that one. They want to watch entertainment and drama. They're not going to sit there listening to 80 recordings of Aqidah, of Wasitiyyah, of Tahawiyah. And this is the mushkila with people. This is the problem with people. Everybody wants entertainment and drama, instead of sitting there, as is the way of the scholars, week by week studying sections and chapters of the Sunnah, of the Aqidah. And because people don't do that, that's why they go astray. They speak without knowledge. And this topic is something which many people have spoken about without knowledge. Even people who made themselves famous, but they haven't got knowledge. The likes of Yusuf Estes, he made mistakes when he gave his explanation about the Quran, and the Quran being the speech of Allah, due to his lack of knowledge. He doesn't have Aqidah understanding and deep understanding of these affairs. So next week we're going to start looking at the evidences regarding this issue of the Quran being the speech of Allah, and that will then clarify to you the correct Aqidah, and therefore you'll be upon understanding and not fall into the misguidances of those who speak incorrectly regarding the topic, insha'Allah ta'ala. So we'll have to conclude upon that today. We'll resume next week straight after Maghrib, straight after the Maghrib prayer next Sunday, insha'Allah, which will be maybe 6:30 p.m. then, insha'Allah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.